Okay, so now we're going to talk about species abundance and diversity. So, abundance and diversity are different, right? So, here we have two communities. They each have an equal amount of diversity in that they both have the same animals in each. However, the abundance is not the same in each community. So, here, elephants are much more abundant than these other animals. Here, everything is more or less equally abundant. Okay, so there are terms and ways to calculate abundance, and there are ways to calculate diversity. So we'll start with an introduction about this. We'll talk about log-normal distributions, environmental complexity, including niches, and then disturbance and diversity. So if you remember, a community is an association of different types of species interacting and living within a specific area. And the community structure is how many species are there of each species. The relative species abundance, so in terms of each other species, and then the species diversity. So how many of each species make up the community structure. A guild, which we talked about before, is a group of organisms that all make their living in the same fashion. So here I have a guild of carnivores of the grasslands of Africa. Okay, so we have a viper, a hawk, a hyena, and fox, and lions. They're all slightly different, but they all make their living kind of in the same way by preying on other animals. Life form is the combination of both structure and growth dynamics. Okay, so there are regularities in the relative abundance of species and communities. So looking at different species and how abundant they are compared to others. It seems to be same no matter what ecosystem you're looking at. And Preston developed these concepts of distribution, of commonness and rarity, which we've talked about before. One of them is called the log-normal distribution. So he graphed the abundance of species in collections. So looking at multiple species and seeing how abundant they were, and how frequently you found them. And what he found was they made up these bell-shaped curves, and most of them were log normal, meaning they had a normal distribution. Okay, so this is a normal distribution. You have heavy representation in the more popular or median abundances. So percent cover is what we have on the x-axis here. So in the middle here you had species in abundance, so the number of species, which correlated with what percentage of the land they covered. So most plant species in this community had moderate coverage. Okay, those that had very extensive coverage, there were very few of those. Okay, same thing when you look at birds in this. Most bead species were moderately abundant. A few of them were rare, and a few of them were very abundant. That's the log-normal distribution. So May proposed the log-normal distribution is just a statistical expectation. So you're just by virtue of statistics, you're going to have some that are more represented than other. But Sugihara suggested that it is a consequence of species within a community subdividing their niches. Okay, so the niches of the most abundant species have the most abundant niches, and so they would be more abundant. Alright, so species diversity. Two factors can define species diversity. Species richness, which is the number of species in the community, and species evenness, which is the relative abundance. So evenness is what we have in this plot of land here. The species are even. Okay, this says lower species evenness. They both have the same number of species, so species richness is the same. One of these, one of these, one of these, and one of these, one of these. So 5 different species. This also has the same 5 species, but they're more even. The Shannon Wiener index then is the used to calculate species diversity. Okay, this is what the equation looks like. H naught is the value of of diversity index. Pi sub I is the proportion of the ith species, and then the log E is the natural log of this proportion, and S is the number of species in the community. So we'll go over how to do this, and there's examples in the book too. Alright, rank abundance curves. This can also portray the relative abundance and species diversity within a community by plotting relative abundance of species against their rank in abundance. Okay, so here's your abundance rank on the x-axis. Here's the proportional abundance. And evenness is indicated by a lower slope. So here you have a steep slope. Okay, that means it is not very even. Here you have a much lesser steep slope, so there's more evenness there. But this also has greater species richness. Okay, so mountain streams have greater richness and species evenness than coastal ponds. Alright, how complex an environment? Generally has to do with heterogeneity or environmental complexity. So how varied different species are within there, or how many layers within a community have species within them. So MacArthur found warbler diversity increased as vegetation stature increased. So then looking at the vertical plane, and he had measured environmental complexity as foliage height. Okay, and so if you have a forest that has many different layers or is heterogeneous in the height of the canopy, then you're going to have more species of bird within there, and that's what he found. Alright, so Hutchison, phytoplankton left people kind of puzzled, because how can you have a diversity of phytoplankton if they live in such a simple environment? It seems like one would just outcompete the other, and you would just have one species of phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are very small, generally autotrophic organisms. But although it doesn't look like it, their environment is actually a little more complex, and that's what accounts for this diversity. So Tillman found coexistence of freshwater diatoms, that's what these are over here, so you see a bunch of different kinds, dependent on the ratio of silicate and phosphate. So different areas had different ratios, different diatoms specialized in different ratios of silicate and phosphate. And so that's what led to the diversity of the environments, which led to the diversity of the organisms. All right, tropical forests, rainforests especially, are the most diverse places in the world as far as the number of species. But Jordan concluded tropical forest diversity was organized in 2 ways. A large number of species that live within most tropical forest communities, and large number of plant communities, which give distinctive species composition. Okay, and he found that changes in soil type and depth and access to groundwater led to vegetation over very short distances. So you have specific species which are going to grow around right next to the stream. The further away you get from the stream, the deeper your roots have to be. So you may have to be have much longer roots. The groundwater, where it is going to determine how far your roots need to go. So this is going to cause a heterogeneous distribution of nutrients, and thus a heterogeneous distribution of niches and organisms. All right, disturbance. Disturbance is difficult to define, but basically it's something that breaks away from the average conditions. But average conditions may also involve a lot of variation. So White and Pickett define disturbance as any relatively discrete event in time that disrupts ecosystem, community, or population structure and changes resources, substrate availability, or the physical environment. So one example might be you have this forest with lots of trees. One of these trees falls over in the woods. Okay, that's going to open up the canopy, so now sunlight can hit the ground, and so now you're going to have different species colonizing that area because you have this event, the falling tree, disrupting the ecosystem, the flow of nutrients and energy, and it's going to change the community or the species that inhabit that area because these new nutrients are available. And it's physically changed as well. So now there's actually a gap in the canopy. So there's two major characteristics which define an ecosystem in reference to disturbances. How often the disturbance occurs and how intense it is. Okay, so a good example of that can be fires or hurricanes along the southeast. Hurricanes come through pretty regularly, but in one area it might not hit one area in the same area. Every 20 years or so you'll get a hurricane, and so that and how intense the hurricane is will determine how big of a disturbance it is. Sometimes some areas will have an abnormal amount, an increase in frequency, so once every 5 years instead of 10 years, and that can change the ecological dynamics. So one of the theories is, how many disturbances or how frequent disturbance or how intense disturbance is going to affect the community structure. And the intermediate disturbance hypothesis is that disturbances that are not too frequent but not too spaced out will increase the diversity the most. So both high and low levels of disturbance reduce diversity. High levels of disturbance are going to make it so that only these R-selected species are going to, colonizing species are going to be abundant. And then low levels of disturbance are going to be dominated by the species that has the K-selected species that can outcompete all the other ones. So intermediate levels are going to give you a range between the two. So colonizing species will be able to be there if you have intermediate disturbance, and some of these competing species, outcompeting species, are going to be there within there. So, but there then is a balance between not allowing these species to competitively exclude and not allowing colonization species to completely outcompete all the others. So, what one study did was they looked at the boulders in the intertidal zone. Okay, and a large boulder will not be moved by the waves. Okay, so it's an example of basically a long disturbance. Okay, so the big boulders won't move, so they are not really being disturbed. Whereas the small boulders will move very easily, and so they are disturbed frequently. And when they looked at small, medium, and large boulders, the small would have the low disturbance, and then the small would have high disturbance. Well, high disturbance had many of these colonizing species there. Low disturbance had these competitive exclusive species, but the intermediate, the medium boulders, they had a diversity of species, and it was relatively even between them. So, giving evidence for this intermediate disturbance hypothesis.